Hello, everyone, and welcome to the REACH podcast, where our focus is on prevention of targeted violence. This is a safe space for sharing meaningful discussions and strategies on violence prevention. I am Nathan Myers, a member of the REACH project team, and I'm excited to be here with you today. Thank you for joining us. The topic we are going to explore today is strengthening violence prevention efforts within Black communities. Black communities experience disproportionately higher rates of violence compared to other demographic groups. Empowering Black communities with targeted resources, support networks, and culturally competent interventions can help enhance community resilience and promote healing and social cohesion. By recognizing and addressing the unique challenges faced by Black individuals and communities, we can create environments where every individual feels safe, valued, and empowered to thrive. Joining us today is Dr. Edward Stephenson. Dr. Stephenson is an associate professor of psychology at the Florida Memorial University at Miami Gardens in Florida. Dr. Stephenson, thank you so much for your time today. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your areas of specialty?
Hi, good afternoon. Glad to be here. My background is my degree is in social psychology with minor in personality psychology. So I graduated about 1987, so I've been teaching for quite a while. My areas of interest are primarily student adjustment. I teach at an HBCU, which is a historically Black college and university. And the work that I've done since I've been there, a lot of it is centered around mental health. We developed a suicide prevention program, which we've been doing for maybe about 15 years now. And so we've collected data in doing that in terms of doing assessments of the program. In addition to that, I've had interest in terms of previous years doing research on poverty within the African American community. Also, I teach 2 graduate courses. One is in personality psychology and the other in minority mental health. And that has been a very important foundation in terms of my research program, as well as just my major interest. Even in preparing for this talk, I found that the whole issue of diversity and cultural competence, and when it comes to the programs, having culturally relevant type of programs is very important. So I've really, developed a very strong appreciation for culture, the importance of culture in whatever we're going to be doing, whether we're teaching, doing research. So that's mainly my background. I did some preliminary literature reviews in the areas of violence prevention, but I'm not deeply there.
Thank you for the introduction. Can you briefly describe the richness and uniqueness of Black communities in the United States, highlighting specific examples that showcase their cultural vibrancy and diversity?
So when I was thinking about this question, one of the things that came to mind is the diversity dimension of it, and how often, especially teaching at an HBCU, there is a perception of these places being monocultural environments, being homogeneous. And surprisingly, when you look at the history, this summer I'm doing some research looking at diversity at my campus and just being fascinated by the literature in terms of the realizing how diverse these campuses have historically been from their conception. You find now that there is a kind of increasing diversity that's taking place, but just really very much appreciating, in terms of the research that I did, the intragroup diversity that I came to see in terms of, at our university, there's a lot of Caribbean students, Jamaican, Haitian American, African students, Latin American, some of which are white, some are Afro-Latin American. So just from that perspective and having those experiences, I think that when you talk about Black communities, I think one of the first things that we need to acknowledge, and especially in terms of doing research as well, is that intergroup diversity. Being Jamaican, you might have a different perspective than, say, being an African-American person, being a Haitian-American person. There are these nuances that exist. But again, in thinking about this issue, what I found myself doing was also, and this I think has been influenced by my exposure to this multicultural framework, as well as looking at things from what you would call an African-centered perspective, which I think is very important, especially in terms of addressing social problems like violence prevention. And in doing that, and talking about the resilience of Black communities, I think we need to look at it from a historical perspective. We need to go back to the roots, the source, which invariably takes us back to Africa. Oftentimes, when people look at Black history, they begin with slavery. So they kind of start out from a negative experiences. And there is no frame of reference to kind of see, well, where did we come from before that in order to understand who we are today, basically. So in the terminology, they use the term Sankofa to refer to that, kind of the need to look back in order to move forward. So what I was thinking is that even addressing things like violence prevention, and in terms of thinking about different interventions that we're going to be implementing, we need to take that, ground ourselves in this African-centered historical perspective, and then try to understand, well, where are we now in relationship to that perspective? And that will kind of give us a kind of a conceptual framework to work with. And so even in terms of my own personal journey, about 8 years ago, I was introduced to what I call comedic psychology, which is very interesting in terms of kind of recognizing that civilization in that time was at the apex of African civilization, right? There's nothing that has surpassed it since then. So it's very important for African people as well as all people to have a knowledge of that history and have an understanding of the philosophy and the psychology of African people from that point of view. And in doing that, you're going to see when I talk about interventions, that becomes very therapeutic in terms of giving you a more clearer perspective of who we are as a people, a better conceptual understanding of where we're coming from, and also being able to better appreciate the type of challenges that we're confronting today. Because a lot of the problems that we have today is a result of those historical events that we've experienced in our past. But even before that, we need to go back to understand what was life like back in that time. What are the type of principles that we lived by? Because what has happened is that we've become divorced from that. And for us to survive and thrive, the question is about resilience. And the point I was trying to make there is that the resilience of Black culture has its source in that past, ancestral past. So in being able to reestablish that and recreate that and bring it into the present is very important in order to reactivate and make more powerful the resilience that we need to kind of move forward.
From your perspective, what are some of the common challenges faced by Black communities in the United States today?
Black communities in the U.S. face a multitude of challenges that are mostly rooted in historical and systemic inequities. These challenges span various aspects of life, including economic disparities, educational inequality, health access, criminal justice, and social discrimination. And I just want to say a word about each of them in terms of, at the top of the list, I would put economic disparities. You see, like in terms of those disparities, the typical white household had 6 times as much wealth as a typical Black household. There's economic inequality, like in terms of unemployment and wages, that kind of thing. So there are multiple challenges, and most of them centering around social, economic, education, housing, healthcare, that kind of thing. Those are some of the main challenges.
Thank you for sharing your insights. Can you discuss the most prevalent forms of violence affecting African American communities today?
Wow, there are so many. One of the main ones, I think, is the criminal justice system as a source of this violence. I think when you look at the history of policing, for instance, it goes back to slavery, where they had slave patrols. So in order to really make sense of the criminal justice system today, we need to have that historical perspective to understand really what is the function of the criminal justice system, and recognizing that a lot of the ways in which it has dealt with African American populations in terms of the oppressive nature of the system is not something that is surprising. It's something that's actually built into the very system itself. But in terms of some other forms of violence, there's a lot of statistics on excessive use of force amongst the police. Gun violence is another big one within the African American community, which there's a lot to talk about there, especially what they call horizontal violence, Black youth killing other Black youth. And again, how we try to understand that really determines the type of solutions and approaches that we use. And what you find is that because of the cultural racism that exists in the society, where Black people are perceived in a very devalued way, it ends up where these approaches tend to take a more victim-blaming type orientation, rather than recognizing the systemic social determinants of these problems, especially violence. Like Black males are stereotyped as being basically bestial, aggressive, criminal-minded, that kind of thing. So when we think about, well, how do we address the violence, we kind of target them in terms of thinking that there's something that we need to do to change them, as opposed to changing the system itself. So there's gun violence. There's also domestic violence. That's also a very big problem within African American communities. So those are some of the main ones, I would say.
That is concerning. What are the key factors contributing to racial disparities in violence, and how do these disparities impact Black communities in the United States?
Again, I would go back recognizing the importance for us to look at it from a historical perspective and recognize the profound impact that slavery had on the African American population, and how a lot of the problems that we have today were based on the type of social structures that were put in place back in that time, and the type of ideologies, particularly ideology of white supremacy, that was put as a foundational principle back in the times of slavery, which we still see very much alive today. Like we're talking about the police, those structures were developed at that period. And now we're seeing how they're still playing out in the present in terms of the oppressive nature that they have towards African American people. So in a very abbreviated way, there are socioeconomic disparities that play a crucial role in contributing to racial disparities and violence. In terms of Black communities, for instance, facing higher levels of poverty, there's this whole very interesting phenomena, the school to prison pipeline, where because of how Black students are treated in classrooms, they end up getting higher suspension rates, detention, that kind of thing will ultimately marginalizes them and setting the stage for them being incarcerated. So that's another big disparity in terms of incarceration rates as well, which when we talk about moving out from slavery, in a sense, slavery has taken a different form within the criminal justice system as far as incarceration and the function that that has served. But those are some of the major disparities that I would talk about.
I appreciate your perspective on this. What impact does media representation have on the perception and reality of violence in marginalized communities?
Oh, that is such a important issue, because back in my time when the media was not, the whole technology was not as so prominent, for people growing up today, I think technology plays such an important role as a source of information. So in terms of, there's a positive and a negative. The negative is that the media is very instrumental in creating images of Black people in a very negative light. When you watch the news, for instance, in terms of how they project crime in the media, again, putting emphasis on people's dispositions, like the crime that's occurring is because of being Black, as opposed to contextualizing it and recognizing the social determinants of why people are behaving in this way. So there's that type of bias, I think, that exist. And when that happens, then that influences people's perceptions, which then has a kind of indirect feedback in terms of when we're thinking about interventions. Our perception is kind of distorted by the stereotypes that we have about Blackness. And so if we think of Black males in particular as being aggressive and violent, then when we think about how we're going to solve this, we develop more, again, victim blaming type interventions. In terms of the positive, I think there's a lot of potential for the media to project positive images to neutralize all the negativity that it has been very instrumental in doing. So, but I don't think we see as much of that as we do the negative.
What are your thoughts on community activism and grassroots organizations? What role do they play in addressing and reducing violence within Black communities?
I think they play a very important role, because when you have like a top-down type of approach to violence projection, you find that it's kind of disconnected from the people themselves in terms of what they actually need. So having a grassroots type of approach is more grounded in the lived experiences of these people. Also, it kind of builds greater trust and engagement in terms of connecting with the people and being able to implement whatever interventions that you're having. Also, it is able to advocate on a part of the group. Although oftentimes a lot of these grassroots organizations don't have a lot of resources, for instance. And so that becomes a big limitation. But it provides resources and support in terms of things like job training, educational programs, mental health services, conflict resolution training, that type of thing. So I would say they're very important.
That leads me to ask, do you know any examples of successful community strategies that have helped reduce violence in Black neighborhoods?
In terms of, I had to do a little research on this one. So I'm not knowledgeable in terms of my personal experiences, but I came across a few that apparently have been found to be successful in different parts of the country. One is in Chicago called Cure Violence Approach, which treats violence as a public health issue. It employs violence interrupters who are trained to mediate conflicts before they escalate. This program has been credited with significant reductions in shootings and killings in various cities, including a 41% reduction in shootings in one Chicago neighborhood within the first year. So there are a few programs like that we can point to. But I think when it comes, this is an area where we then have to become very nuanced in terms of recognizing the importance of being culturally relevant, because a lot of these, especially when what I call evidence-based programs, are the research is standardized around mostly white people. And so there's not included in their samples African-American people. And so when you try to generalize from them to the African-American community, you really come up against a lot of limitations there. So it's very important to ground these approaches, like I was saying earlier, in a way that is culturally relevant to this population. And even more specifically in this African-centered cultural framework. I did come across one program which I actually read about recently called the Hawk Federation Rites of Passage Program. This was sponsored by the Institute of Advanced Study of Black Family Life, which is basically a rite of passage program. One of the things of Black males is that, like if you go back to Africa again, there was a rite of passage that males went through, and females, to know when they're adults. In this culture, there's nothing like that. And so the value that these programs have is to re-educate and reorient Black people in terms of regrounding them in their value, their cultural orientation, which has been displaced by being in this country. And having that foundation is very important for you to be resilient, for you to thrive. You need to, understand who you are or who you were actually. So to the extent that these programs does have this type of cultural emphasis, I think is very important, I would say.
Now let's look at technology and social media. How can technology and social media be leveraged to support violence prevention efforts?
In a lot of ways, I think, like I said, we were saying earlier, technology is becoming very important, especially for younger generations. Like as a teacher, I'm finding I'm being outwitted by my students as far as this technology is concerned. But in terms of violence prevention, they were important in terms of awareness campaigns. Social media platforms can be used to run awareness campaigns about the impacts of violence and the importance of prevention. Education, in terms of educating people about violence prevention. I was on a webinar yesterday about suicide prevention. This African-American person who just graduated, got her PhD at Berkeley, did a presentation on suicide. And there were like 1,000 people on the line, and very, very valuable information. You can have virtual communities, which are online forums, groups, social media pages, can create virtual communities where individuals can share experiences. So there's a lot of value, I think, to technology when it comes to educating and increasing people's awareness and knowledge.
Building on what we've covered so far, what support systems and resources are most effective in helping victims of violence in Black communities recover and thrive?
So, wow, very important, because being a victim of violence is extremely traumatizing for the individual who experiences it, as well as the community of which they are part. So mental health services is important in terms of providing access to these services for people, specifically also trauma-informed care. Again, it's incredible talking about the resilience of African-American people and how they've been able to thrive and overcome a lot of the traumatic experiences that they have been through back in the past and in the present. Living in these communities that is so much concentrated with poverty and gun violence in itself is traumatizing. So mental health becomes very important. Legal assistance as well becomes important. People can't afford this, so providing access to lawyers that can be supportive in terms of the type of needs that people have. Economic support becomes very important in terms of job trainings, financial assistance, housing assistance, education and skill development, healthcare, community-based support. All of this becomes very important on a community level.
Before we wrap up, how can we promote resilience in Black communities? Again,
I think first recognizing the disparities and the challenges that exist. But in terms of actually on a community level, I think job training programs is important. We're living in a time where technology is making people's skills obsolete. So you have to be going through this constant retraining, supporting Black-owned businesses. We saw how important that was during the time of COVID, where a lot of people lost their business. So having that type of support, having access to comprehensive health services and education is also important. I think education is very foundational in terms of establishing mentoring programs, scholarships for students. What I was going to talk about in relation to this, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I was kind of in terms of using that as a conceptual framework to talk about the different needs that African-American people have in relationship to community resources. So at the bottom level of Maslow's hierarchy are physiological needs, what you need to survive. Well, in the context of this society, that translates into monetary needs, basically, right? Being able to economic needs. And so going back to financial needs is very important. On another level, he talks about safety and security. So again, having safe communities in terms of strengthening community ties, providing resources within the communities that can keep them safe, protect them from the police sometimes. On another level, there is what he calls love and belonging needs, which has more to do with relationships. And we saw this during COVID, how our relationships were so disrupted and the consequences that this had for mental health. So having healthy relationships within these communities and providing ways of providing that type of, encouraging that type of relationship to exist. On another level, in terms of esteem needs, the whole issue of mental health becomes important in terms of elevating people's self-esteem. A lot of times, things like violence is on a psychological level, has to do with these psychological issues that people might have as far as low self-esteem and just general mental health issues, depression, suicide, that kind of thing. And then lastly, in terms of Maslow, he talks about self-actualization. And I think there's a lot of problems with Maslow's model, but as far as this is relating to what we're talking about today, I think what would be important for Black people to really actualize their full potential is addressing these systemic inequities, being able to satisfy these foundational needs like economic needs, health, being able to, food insecurity, that type of thing, being able to satisfy those needs so that we're then able to elevate ourselves as far as this whole concept of actualizing our potential is concerned.
Thank you so much for your time today. We really appreciate your insights on this.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I enjoyed your interview. I'm glad to meet you all.